The snow fell thick and silent over the textile factory in the winter of 1942, but inside, the air was thick with steam, the deafening clatter of industrial washing machines, and a fury that no one could see. Her name was Marie, a 43-year-old woman with calloused hands and a face that had learned long ago not to show emotion. She stood at her station, feeding endless piles of wool uniforms into the scalding water, her movements mechanical, her eyes distant. To anyone watching, she was just another laundress in a city under occupation, another faceless worker keeping the war machine running. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that Marie was about to commit an act of sabotage so subtle, so devastating, that it would send 500 enemy soldiers into the frozen hell of the Eastern Front wearing uniforms that no longer fit. Uniforms that had mysteriously shrunk 2, sometimes 3 sizes too small. This is the story they never wanted you to know. This is the story of how one woman turned laundry into a weapon. Before the tanks rolled through the cobblestone streets, before the flags changed and the curfews began, Marie's life had been ordinary in the way that most lives are ordinary. She had worked at the same factory for 18 years, washing linens for hotels, hospitals, and the occasional military contract. Her husband had died in the First War, the one they said would end all wars, and her 2 sons were somewhere out there in the chaos, fighting for the resistance or hiding in the mountains. She didn't know which, and the not knowing was a weight she carried in her chest every single day. The factory had been her refuge, a place where the rhythm of work could drown out the questions that had no answers. But then they came. The occupation forces requisitioned the factory within a week, and suddenly Marie wasn't washing hotel sheets anymore. She was washing the uniforms of the men who had taken her country, the men who patrolled her streets with rifles and dogs, the men who had made her own language illegal to speak in public. The new orders were simple and absolute. Every week the factory received shipments of hundreds of wool uniforms, heavy winter gear designed to protect soldiers from the brutal cold of the Russian front. The work was grueling, and the quotas were merciless. Any deviation, any delay, any mistake could mean arrest, interrogation, or worse. The supervisors were local collaborators, men who had traded their dignity for safety, and they watched the workers with the paranoia of people who knew they were hated. Marie kept her head down, did her work, and said nothing. She had learned that invisibility was a form of survival, but invisibility also meant opportunity, because while the supervisors watched for open rebellion, for sabotaged machines or ruined fabric, they never thought to watch the temperature dials on the washing machines. They never thought that the mundane act of adjusting water temperature could become an act of war. It started as an accident, or at least that's what Marie told herself at first. One morning, distracted by exhaustion and the gnawing worry about her sons, she set the water temperature too high on a batch of 50 uniforms. When she pulled them from the machines, the wool had tightened, the fibers constricting in the heat until the jackets and pants were visibly smaller. Her heart stopped. This was a fireable offense at best, a death sentence at worst. But then, as she stared at the ruined uniforms, a different thought crept into her mind, cold and clear as winter itself. What if it wasn't an accident? What if she did it again? What if she did it to every single batch that came through her station? The idea was terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure. She could hurt them, not with guns or bombs, but with something far more insidious. She could send them into the cold-wearing uniforms that didn't fit, uniforms that would restrict their movement, cut off their circulation, leave gaps where the freezing wind could slip through. The risks were enormous, and Marie understood them with brutal clarity. If anyone discovered what she was doing, there would be no trial, no second chances. The collaborators would make an example of her, and her sons, if they were still alive, would never know what she had done or why. But the alternative was to keep washing uniforms properly, to keep helping the enemy stay warm while her own people froze and starved. That thought was unbearable, so Marie made her choice. She would be careful, methodical, invisible. She would vary the temperatures just enough that it looked like inconsistent machinery rather than deliberate sabotage. She would spread the damage across multiple batches so no single load looked suspicious. And she would do it for as long as she possibly could, because if she couldn't fight with a rifle, she would fight with boiling water and shrunken wool. Over the next 6 weeks, 500 uniforms passed through Marie's station, and 500 uniforms came out smaller, tighter, useless, against the kind of cold that turned breath to ice and skin to stone. She never spoke of it, never hinted at it, never allowed herself even a flicker of satisfaction when the crates were loaded onto trucks and shipped east. But every night when she walked home through the occupied streets, she thought about those soldiers opening their supply crates somewhere on the frozen steppe, pulling on uniforms that no longer fit, and she allowed herself the smallest, most dangerous feeling in the world: hope. The factory itself was a relic from another era, a massive brick structure built in the late 1800s when the city had been a center of textile production for all of Europe. Its windows were tall and narrow, most of them cracked or missing entirely, covered now with rough wooden boards that let in slivers of grey winter light. The floor was concrete, perpetually damp from the steam and the water that sloshed from the industrial machines, and the air smelled of wet wool, harsh soap, and the acrid chemical stench of the bleaching agents they used to strip stains from fabric. There were 42 workers in total, mostly women over the age of 35, their hands raw and reddened from the constant exposure to hot water and lye. They worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, and the pay was barely enough to buy bread on the black market. But work meant a labor card, and a labor card meant you were useful, and being useful meant you were slightly less likely to be rounded up and shipped to a work camp in the east. Marie had been assigned to Station 7, one of the large industrial washing units near the back of the factory floor, where the noise was loudest and the supervision was lightest. It was perfect positioning for what she intended to do, though she hadn't realized it at first. The machine itself was a hulking German-made monstrosity, all steel drums and complex valve systems, with temperature controls that required constant manual adjustment. The supervisors had given the workers a single training session when the occupation began, showing them the proper settings for washing military wool: warm water, never hot, gentle agitation to preserve the fiber integrity. Marie had nodded along with everyone else, memorizing the instructions with the same careful attention she gave to everything. But she had also noticed something the supervisors hadn't bothered to mention. The temperature gauge was old and imprecise, and the difference between warm and scalding was only 2 small turns of a dial that was located on the side of the machine, partially hidden behind a metal housing panel where no one thought to look. The first deliberate act of sabotage happened on a Tuesday morning in late November, 3 weeks after the accidental shrinking that had given her the idea. Marie had spent those 3 weeks watching, learning the patterns of the supervisors, understanding who paid attention and who didn't. She learned that the head supervisor, a man named Duchamp, who wore his collaboration like a badge of honor, made his rounds every hour but never stayed at any single station for more than 2 minutes. She learned that the assistant supervisors were lazy and incompetent, more interested in stealing supplies to sell on the black market than actually monitoring the work. And she learned that if she timed her adjustments correctly, she could turn the temperature dial up to near boiling levels, run the cycle and turn it back down before anyone walked past her station. The first batch was 25 uniforms, heavy winter coats with fur-lined collars. She fed them into the drum with steady hands, closed the hatch, and then, with her body blocking the view, reached around and turned the dial 3 full rotations to the right. The cycle ran for 35 minutes, and those 35 minutes felt like 35 hours. Marie continued working, sorting the next batch, checking seams for damage as she was supposed to, her face blank and unremarkable. When the buzzer finally sounded and she opened the drum, the steam that poured out was thick enough to sting her eyes. She pulled the uniforms out one by one, and even through the heat and the moisture she could feel it. The wool had tightened, the sleeves were shorter, the chest measurements had contracted. A coat that should have fit a man 6 feet tall would now barely close around someone 5'8". It had worked. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment she thought she might be sick, but she forced herself to breathe, to keep moving, to hang the uniforms on the drying racks as if nothing at all had changed. By the end of that first week, she had ruined 75 uniforms. By the end of the second week, the number had climbed to 150. Marie developed a system, a careful rotation that kept her safe. She never sabotaged 2 batches in a row, never created a pattern that could be traced. Sometimes she would go 3 days doing the work perfectly, letting properly washed uniforms pass through her station without incident, building a record of reliability that would protect her when suspicion eventually came. And it would come, she knew that. The enemy wasn't stupid, and eventually someone on the Eastern Front would notice that uniforms from this particular factory were consistently undersized. But by then, Marie calculated, she would have already done enough damage to matter. The cold on the Russian front was reported to drop to -40 degrees in the deep winter. A uniform that didn't fit properly in that kind of cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a death sentence. The breaking point came not from the enemy but from within the factory itself, and it came from a place Marie had never anticipated. Her name was Colette, a younger woman of 26 who worked 2 stations down from Marie, washing officer uniforms and dress clothing that required more delicate handling. Colette was pretty in a way that had become dangerous during the occupation, with dark eyes and high cheekbones that drew unwanted attention from the soldiers who occasionally inspected the factory. She kept her hair covered and her head down, but there was something in her posture, a tightness in her shoulders that Marie recognized immediately. Colette was afraid, not just of the occupation, but of something more specific, more personal. Marie had seen that kind of fear before in women who had been cornered, propositioned, or worse. They began talking during the brief 10-minute lunch break, sharing the meager portions of bread and thin soup that the factory provided, and slowly, carefully, Colette began to reveal her story. Her brother was in the resistance, operating somewhere in the southern mountains, and the local Gestapo had been questioning her weekly, trying to extract information she genuinely didn't have. The questioning had grown more aggressive in recent weeks, and Colette was terrified that she would be arrested simply to pressure her brother into surrendering. She confided this to Marie in whispers, her voice shaking, and Marie listened with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes people just needed to speak their terror aloud, to keep from drowning in it. But then Colette said something that made Marie's blood run cold. She said that one of the assistant supervisors, a weasel-faced man named Bernard, had offered her protection in exchange for information about the other workers. He wanted to know if anyone was slowing down production, stealing supplies, or showing signs of disloyalty. He had promised Colette that if she reported anything suspicious, he would personally ensure that the Gestapo left her alone. Colette swore she had refused, swore she would never collaborate, but Marie could hear the desperation in her voice. The girl was breaking, and when people broke under that kind of pressure, they made choices they never thought they would make. Marie understood in that moment that her window of safety was closing faster than she had anticipated. If Colette was being pressured to inform, others probably were too, and it was only a matter of time before someone noticed the pattern of shrunken uniforms coming from Station 7. Marie had always known this operation had an expiration date, but she had hoped for more time, hoped to reach at least 300 or 400 uniforms before the inevitable investigation began. She was currently at 227, and every instinct told her to stop immediately, to return to washing uniforms properly and hope that the damage she had already done would be enough. But stopping meant letting the enemy win, meant choosing her own survival over the possibility of saving lives on the other side of the continent. It meant watching the next shipment of uniforms leave the factory, knowing she could have done more but chose comfort instead. That thought was unbearable, so Marie made a decision that was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and perhaps in wartime there was no difference between the two. She accelerated her sabotage, throwing caution aside in a calculated gamble that she could reach 500 uniforms before anyone caught on. She began sabotaging every other batch instead of every third or fourth, increasing the temperature even higher, to ensure maximum shrinkage, pushing the limits of what the machines could handle without producing visible smoke or triggering safety shutdowns. The risk was enormous, but Marie had done the mathematics in her head during sleepless nights. 500 uniforms meant 500 soldiers potentially incapacitated by the cold, and if even half of those soldiers were taken out of combat due to frostbite, exposure, or hypothermia, that was 250 fewer rifles pointed at her countrymen. It was 250 fewer men kicking down doors, burning villages, executing civilians in town squares. The numbers justified the risk, Or at least that's what she told herself every morning when she walked through the factory doors, knowing it might be the last time. The physical toll of the accelerated pace was severe, and Marie felt it in every bone of her 53-year-old body. Her hands, already damaged from years of industrial washing, developed deep cracks that bled into the water, turning it faintly pink. Her back ached from the constant bending and lifting, and she developed a cough from inhaling too much steam and chemical vapor in poorly ventilated spaces. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her face becoming gaunt and shadowed, and the other workers began to notice. Several asked if she was sick, if she needed to see the factory nurse, and Marie deflected with vague mentions of not sleeping well and bad food from the ration lines. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. She was burning herself out deliberately, spending every ounce of energy and health she had left to destroy as many uniforms as possible before the hammer came down. By mid-December, she had reached 433 uniforms. She was so close to her goal that she could taste it. The investigation began on a Thursday morning in the second week of December, and it began exactly the way Marie had known it would. A staff car pulled up to the factory entrance just after dawn, black and polished despite the muddy streets, and two men in long coats stepped out with the unhurried confidence of people who held absolute power. One was Gestapo, identifiable by the silver insignia on his collar and the cold, evaluative way his eyes swept across the factory floor. The other was a quartermaster officer from the Wehrmacht Supply Division, carrying a leather folder thick with paperwork and complaint forms. They spoke briefly with Duchamp, the head supervisor, and Marie watched from her station as the color drained from his face. Whatever they were telling him, it wasn't good news, and within minutes the entire factory had gone silent, as word spread through whispers and nervous glances. An inspection was coming, a real one, not the cursory walkthroughs they had grown accustomed to. Someone, somewhere on the Eastern Front, had noticed that uniforms from this facility were arriving undersized. The two officers began their investigation methodically, starting at Station 1 and working their way across the factory floor, examining machines, questioning workers, checking temperature settings and soap measurements. Marie continued working, her hands moving through the familiar motions of sorting, loading and washing, but her mind was racing through scenarios and possibilities. She had 67 uniforms left to reach 500, 67 more acts of sabotage that now seemed impossibly far away. The smart thing to do was stop immediately, destroy any evidence of tampering, and hope that the investigation couldn't trace the problem to her specific station. But Marie had never been particularly smart about self-preservation, and besides, the officers were still 4 stations away. She had time for one more batch, maybe 2 if she was fast and lucky. The decision was made before she fully realized she was making it. She loaded 30 uniforms into the drum, closed the hatch, and turned the temperature dial all the way to maximum, far beyond anything she had dared before. The machine shuddered as the water heated to near boiling, and Marie could feel the vibration through the concrete floor. Steam began pouring from the edges of the drum hatch, more than usual, enough that one of the other workers glanced over with a concerned expression. Marie ignored her, keeping her eyes forward, her face blank. The cycle ran for 20 minutes, and every second felt like an eternity. She could hear the officers getting closer, their voices carrying over the machinery noise as they questioned the woman at Station 5 about proper washing procedures. When the buzzer finally sounded, Marie opened the hatch and was hit by a wall of steam so thick it momentarily blinded her. She reached in, pulled out the first uniform, and felt the wool literally hot enough to burn her already damaged hands. The shrinkage was severe, far more than any previous batch. A jacket that should have fit a large man would now barely close around a teenager. It was perfect, and it was damning. She had just finished hanging the last of the 30 uniforms on the drying rack when the officers arrived at Station 7. The Gestapo man looked at her with dead eyes that revealed nothing, while the quartermaster officer examined the machine settings with professional scrutiny. Duchamp hovered behind them, sweating despite the cold, clearly terrified that whatever was wrong would be blamed on his management. The quartermaster checked the temperature dial, frowned, and then checked it again. He asked Marie directly, in accented but functional French, what temperature she used for washing military wool. Marie answered in a voice that was calm and steady, reciting the exact specifications she had been taught, the safe temperatures that would never damage the fabric. The quartermaster nodded, made a note in his folder, and then did something Marie hadn't anticipated. He reached behind the machine housing and pulled out the dial itself, examining it closely under the weak factory lighting. For several long seconds, he said nothing, and Marie felt her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. Then the quartermaster turned to Duchamp and said something in rapid German that Marie couldn't fully follow, but she caught enough words to understand. The dial was old, he said. The calibration was off. These machines were pre-war models, he said, never designed for the volume and intensity of military washing. The shrinkage wasn't sabotage, he concluded. It was equipment failure combined with worker error and inadequate training. Duchamp nearly collapsed with relief, immediately promising to requisition new machines and implement additional training protocols. The Gestapo man looked unconvinced, his eyes lingering on Marie for a moment longer than was comfortable, but ultimately he deferred to the quartermaster's technical expertise. They moved on to Station 8, and Marie exhaled a breath she didn't know she had been holding. She had just gotten away with it, at least for now, but more importantly, she now understood something crucial. She had 37 uniforms left to reach 500, and the officers had just given her the perfect cover story. Equipment failure, worker error, inadequate training. If she was going to finish what she started, it had to be today, right now, before they returned with new machines or new supervisors who might actually know what they were looking for. The rest of that Thursday became a test of nerve unlike anything Marie had ever experienced, and she had lived through an occupation, buried a husband, and lost contact with both her sons. The officers completed their inspection by early afternoon, issued a formal warning to Duchamps about equipment maintenance, and departed in their staff car with a promise to return in 1 week to verify that corrective measures had been implemented. The moment they were gone, the factory erupted in nervous chatter and relieved laughter, workers exchanging stories about close calls and thanking whatever gods they still believed in that no one had been arrested. Duchamp called an emergency meeting, shouting about new protocols and threatening termination for anyone who deviated from proper procedures, but Marie barely heard him. She was calculating. 37 uniforms divided by her remaining work hours meant she could finish today if she pushed hard, if she took no breaks, if she ran continuous cycles back to back without pause. It would be obvious. It would be reckless. But the officers had already inspected her station and moved on. They wouldn't be back today, and by tomorrow new machines might arrive, or new supervisors might be assigned. It was now or never. She started immediately after the meeting ended, loading the maximum capacity into her machine and cranking the temperature to dangerous levels. The other workers were too distracted by their own relief to notice what she was doing, and the supervisors were huddled in the office filling out paperwork and probably drinking the contraband liquor they kept hidden in a filing cabinet. Marie worked with mechanical precision, her damaged hands moving through the motions despite the pain. Her mind focused entirely on the count. 30 uniforms processed, 34, 36. Each batch came out smaller than the last, the wool fibers contracting so severely that some of the jackets looked like they belonged in a children's clothing store. She stopped trying to hide the damage, stopped varying her methods to create plausible deniability. If anyone looked closely at the drying racks, they would see the evidence immediately, but Marie was betting that no one would look closely today, that everyone was too rattled by the inspection to pay attention to anything except staying out of trouble. The final batch went into the machine at 4:30 in the afternoon, just as the winter sun was beginning to set and the factory lights flickered on overhead. Marie loaded 7 uniforms, all that remained of her quota, and set the temperature so high that the machine actually groaned in protest, metal expanding against metal in a way that sounded almost alive. She stood there watching the cycle run, her body swaying slightly from exhaustion and hunger, and for the first time in weeks she allowed herself to think about what she had actually accomplished. 500 uniforms. 500 soldiers who would receive gear that didn't fit properly, gear that would fail them when they needed it most, gear that might mean the difference between survival and freezing to death in a foxhole somewhere east of Moscow. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of a war that was consuming millions of lives, but it was something, and something was infinitely more than nothing. When the cycle finished, and Marie opened the drum for the last time, pulling out those final 7 uniforms and feeling the telltale tightness of overshrunk wool, she experienced an emotion she hadn't felt since before the occupation began. Not happiness exactly, and certainly not pride, but a kind of grim satisfaction that came from knowing she had fought back in the only way available to her. She had been invisible for so long, just another old woman keeping her head down and trying to survive, but for 6 weeks she had been something else. She had been dangerous. She had been a weapon, and the enemy had never even known she was there. Marie hung the last uniform on the drying rack, wiped her bleeding hands on her apron, and walked out of the factory that evening with her head high for the first time in months. She had done what she set out to do, and whatever came next, whether it was discovery or escape or simply more days of invisible survival, she would face it knowing that she had mattered. But what Marie didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know as she walked through the frozen streets toward her small apartment, was that the story didn't end with her final batch. The investigation wasn't over, and the Gestapo man with the dead eyes had noticed something that the quartermaster had missed. He had noticed the way Marie's hands shook when he questioned her, not with fear, but with exhaustion. He had noticed the pink-tinged water in her washing drum, blood from her cracked and damaged skin. He had noticed the pattern of shrinkage that seemed concentrated around certain stations, and while he had deferred to technical expertise during the inspection, he was not a man who forgot details or ignored instincts. That evening, while Marie was finally allowing herself to rest, the Gestapo man was sitting in his office reviewing production records and making a list of workers who would require additional questioning. Marie's name was third on that list, and the interrogation was scheduled for Monday morning. Friday and Saturday passed in a blur of normalcy that felt surreal and fragile, like walking across ice that could crack at any moment. Marie went to work both days, washed uniforms at the proper temperatures with meticulous care, and tried not to think about the fact that her sabotage was now complete and irreversible. The 500 ruined uniforms had already been packaged, crated, and shipped east on Thursday evening, loaded onto trains that were probably halfway to the front lines by now. There was no taking it back, no undoing what she had done, and that finality was both terrifying and liberating. She noticed small changes in the factory atmosphere, a tension that hadn't been there before the inspection. Duchamp was more nervous than usual, snapping at workers over minor infractions and spending long periods locked in his office making phone calls. The assistant supervisors were actually supervising for once, walking the floor with clipboards and checking machine settings, with an attention to detail that suggested they had been threatened with consequences if another problem arose. But nobody questioned Marie directly. Nobody pulled her aside or asked uncomfortable questions, and by Saturday evening, she began to allow herself the dangerous luxury of hope that maybe, just maybe, she had gotten away with it. Sunday was her day off, and Marie spent it the way she spent every Sunday since the occupation began, attending Mass at the small church 3 blocks from her apartment. The priest was an old man who had lost most of his congregation to fear, deportation, or collaboration, but he still performed the service every week for the dozen or so people who showed up. Marie sat in the same pew she always sat in, third from the front on the left side, and went through the familiar motions of prayer without really thinking about what she was praying for. Afterwards, she walked to the cemetery where her husband was buried, a ritual she maintained even though the grave was just a marker now, the body long since returned to earth. She stood there in the cold, her breath misting in the air, and for the first time she spoke aloud about what she had done. She told her dead husband about the 500 uniforms, about the risk and the fear and the satisfaction of fighting back. She told him that she hoped their sons were alive somewhere, that they were fighting too in whatever way they could, and she told him that if Monday brought the Gestapo to her door, she wouldn't regret what she had done. Some things were worth dying for, and dignity was one of them. Monday morning arrived with fresh snow and temperatures cold enough to freeze the moisture in her lungs. Marie dressed carefully, putting on her cleanest clothes and the small silver cross her husband had given her on their wedding day. She wasn't sure why she did this, wasn't even consciously thinking about the possibility of arrest, but some instinct told her to prepare herself for something more than an ordinary workday. She arrived at the factory 15 minutes early, as she always did, and immediately noticed the black staff car parked outside the main entrance. Her stomach dropped, but she forced herself to keep walking, to show no reaction, to be invisible one more time. Inside, the factory floor was nearly silent despite the presence of workers at their stations. Everyone was looking toward the office, where Duchamp stood talking to two men in long coats. One of them was the Gestapo officer from Thursday's inspection. The other was someone new, older, with silver hair and the kind of face that suggested he had stopped caring about human suffering a long time ago. Duchamp spotted Marie, and his face went pale. He said something to the Gestapo officers and pointed in her direction, and Marie felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. This was it. The moment she had known was coming, the inevitable consequence of choosing resistance over survival. The older officer began walking toward her, his boots clicking on the concrete with the rhythm of a countdown, and Marie forced herself to stand straight, to meet his eyes, to show nothing but the blank compliance of a factory worker who had no idea why she was being singled out. He stopped 3 feet away from her, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath and see the small scar above his left eyebrow. He asked her name, and Marie gave it. He asked how long she had worked at the factory, and Marie told him. Then he asked the question she had been dreading, the question that meant everything was about to come apart. He asked her if she knew why 507 uniforms, processed through Station 7 over the past 6 weeks, had arrived at the Eastern Front undersized, with shrinkage patterns consistent with exposure to water temperatures far exceeding recommended levels. He asked her if she understood that this constituted sabotage of military equipment, a crime punishable by immediate execution. And then, before Marie could formulate any kind of response, before she could decide whether to lie or confess, or simply remain silent, something completely unexpected happened. Colette, the young woman from Station 5 who had been pressured to inform, stepped forward from her station and said in a clear, loud voice that carried across the entire factory floor that the problem wasn't sabotage but equipment malfunction, and that she had witnessed Marie repeatedly trying to report the faulty temperature controls to supervisors who had ignored her complaints because they were too busy stealing supplies to care about Mac. Hine maintenance. The silence that followed Colette's statement was absolute and suffocating, the kind of silence that precedes either violence or revelation. Every worker on the factory floor had stopped moving, frozen in place like figures in a photograph, and Marie felt her heart hammering so hard she thought it might actually break through her ribs. She hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for the possibility that someone else would step into the line of fire, especially not Colette, the terrified young woman who had been on the edge of collaboration just weeks earlier. The Gestapo officer turned slowly to face Colette, his expression unreadable, and asked her to repeat what she had just said. Colette did, her voice shaking now but still audible, explaining that she had personally witnessed Marie approach Duchamp on 3 separate occasions to report that the temperature controls on Station 7 were malfunctioning, that the dial settings didn't match the actual water temperature, and that Duchamp had dismissed these complaints as worker incompetence. It was a lie, a complete fabrication, but it was also exactly the kind of lie that had a chance of working, because it contained elements of truth that were impossible to disprove. The older Gestapo officer looked at Duchamp, who had gone from pale to grey, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. He stammered something about having no memory of such complaints, about maintaining proper records, about running an efficient operation, but his voice lacked conviction, and everyone in the room could hear it. The officer asked to see the maintenance logs for Station 7, and Duchamp practically ran to his office to retrieve them, returning moments later with a thin folder that clearly hadn't been updated in months. The officer flipped through the pages, his expression growing colder with each turn, and then he did something that made Marie's blood run ice cold. He walked over to Station 7, reached behind the machine housing exactly as the quartermaster had done days earlier, and physically removed the temperature control dial from its mounting. He held it up to the light, examining it closely, and Marie could see what he was seeing. The dial was old-worn. The calibration marks faded almost to illegibility. It was the kind of equipment that should have been replaced years ago, the kind of negligent maintenance that could absolutely cause the kind of problems they were investigating. But Marie also knew something the officer didn't know, something that would doom her if he thought to check. The dial had been perfectly functional until Thursday afternoon, when she had pushed it far beyond its design limits, running water at near boiling temperatures for hours on end. The wear and tear he was seeing wasn't from years of neglect, it was from days of deliberate abuse. And if he compared this dial to the ones on other machines, if he brought in a technical expert to examine the damage patterns, the truth would become obvious. Marie stood there waiting for that realization to dawn on his face, waiting for the moment when he would order a more thorough investigation, but instead he turned to Duchamp and began speaking in German, his tone sharp and accusatory. Duchamp responded with increasing desperation, gesturing wildly, and Marie caught enough words to understand that the supervisor was being blamed for the equipment failure, for inadequate oversight, for running a sloppy operation that had cost the Wehrmacht hundreds of unusable uniforms at a critical moment in the war. The interrogation continued for another 20 minutes, but the focus had shifted entirely away from Marie and onto Duchamp and the factory management. Other workers began stepping forward, emboldened by Colette's example, sharing their own stories of reported maintenance issues that had been ignored, of safety concerns that had been dismissed, of a supervisor more interested in black market profiteering than actual factory operations. It was an avalanche of grievances, some real and some invented on the spot, but all of them served the same purpose, which was redirecting the Gestapo's attention away from sabotage and toward bureaucratic incompetence. Marie watched it happen with a mixture of awe and terror, understanding that her fellow workers were risking everything to protect her, that they had somehow figured out what she had done and were collectively choosing to shield her from the consequences. She wanted to stop them, wanted to tell them not to risk themselves for her sake, but she also understood that speaking up now would only make things worse for everyone. Finally, the older Gestapo officer made his decision. He informed Duchamp that he was being removed from his position effective immediately, that a new supervisor would be installed by week's end, and that all equipment in the factory would be inspected and replaced where necessary. He informed the workers that any future irregularities would result in the entire facility being shut down and all personnel being sent to labor camps in the east. And then, without another word to Marie, without even looking in her direction again, he turned and walked out of the factory with his younger colleague following behind. The black staff car pulled away, and for several long seconds nobody moved or spoke. Then slowly, the workers began returning to their stations. The machines started up again, and the factory returned to its normal rhythm of noise and steam and exhaustion. Marie stood at Station 7, her hands trembling, and looked across the floor to where Colette was already back at work. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Colette gave the smallest nod before looking away. No words were exchanged, no thanks were offered, but Marie understood the message. They were all in this together now, bound by shared risk and shared resistance. The weeks that followed Duchamp's removal brought changes to the factory that were both expected and deeply unsettling in ways Marie hadn't anticipated. The new supervisor was a German civilian named Herr Kessler, a thin man in his late 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the meticulous demeanor of someone who had spent his entire life managing textile operations. He arrived with a team of technicians who spent 3 full days inspecting every machine, replacing faulty parts and installing new temperature control systems that were supposedly foolproof and tamper-resistant. The dial on Station 7 was replaced with a digital gauge that locked at preset temperatures, and Marie understood immediately that her days of sabotage were over. The new equipment made it impossible to adjust the heat beyond approved levels without triggering visible alarms, and Kessler himself made a point of walking the floor multiple times per shift, checking settings and recording data with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that left no room for deviation. The window had closed, and Marie had to accept that her war, at least this particular battle, was finished. But what haunted Marie more than the end of her sabotage was the question of what had actually happened to those 500 uniforms, and whether her actions had made any difference at all. She had no way of knowing if the shrunken gear had reached the front lines, if soldiers had actually worn them into combat, if anyone had suffered or died because of what she had done. The uncertainty was a weight that pressed on her constantly, especially during the long sleepless nights when she lay in her cold apartment wondering if she had committed murder or performed an act of resistance, and whether there was even a meaningful difference between the two. She tried to convince herself that soldiers who chose to serve an invasion force had forfeited their right to her compassion, that they were legitimate targets in a war they had started. But the logic felt hollow when she thought about the possibility of some 18-year-old conscript freezing to death in a trench because his jacket was 2 sizes too small. War made monsters of everyone, she realized, even the people who fought against it. The answer came in late January, delivered not through official channels, but through the underground network of rumors and whispered information that sustained occupied populations when formal news was censored or propaganda. A woman who cleaned offices for the German military administration mentioned to another woman at the bread line that she had overheard officers complaining about supply problems on the Eastern Front. That woman told her sister, who told her neighbor, who eventually told Marie during a chance encounter at the church. The story was fragmented and impossible to verify, but the details were specific enough to sound credible. Apparently, a shipment of winter uniforms from a textile factory in their city had arrived at a Wehrmacht supply depot in early December, and when the uniforms were distributed to troops preparing for a winter offensive, hundreds of soldiers had reported sizing problems. The uniforms were too small, restrictive, poorly fitted, and in the brutal cold of the Russian winter, that meant gaps in coverage, restricted circulation, and vastly increased susceptibility to frostbite. The offensive had gone forward anyway, because delays were unacceptable, and replacement uniforms would take weeks to arrive, and the results had been catastrophic. Entire platoons had been pulled from the line with cold weather injuries, field hospitals had been overwhelmed with frostbite cases, and several soldiers had actually died from exposure-related complications that might have been prevented with properly fitted gear. The numbers were unclear and probably exaggerated in the retelling, but even the most conservative estimates suggested that dozens of soldiers had been incapacitated and at least a handful had died, not from enemy fire, but from the simple fact that their uniforms didn't fit. The story made its way through the occupied city like wildfire, whispered in breadlines and market stalls and factory floors, and while no one said Marie's name directly, she could feel the weight of knowing glances from the other workers who had protected her. They knew what she had done, and they knew it had worked. Marie's initial reaction to this news was complex and contradictory in ways she struggled to process. Part of her felt a savage satisfaction, a vindication of the risk she had taken and the suffering she had endured. She had hurt them, had struck a blow against an enemy that seemed invincible, and the fact that her actions had actual measurable consequences felt like proof that individual resistance mattered, even in the face of overwhelming power. But another part of her, the part that had raised 2 sons and buried a husband and understood the fundamental humanity of even the worst people, felt a creeping horror at what she had done. She had caused suffering, had contributed to death, had become exactly the kind of person she had always believed herself to be fighting against. The soldiers who froze in those trenches had mothers and wives and maybe children of their own, and while Marie could rationalize their deaths as necessary casualties of war, she couldn't escape the knowledge that she had made a deliberate choice to cause that suffering. There was no moral high ground in war, she realized, only different depths of necessary evil. The winter of 1943 came and went with agonizing slowness, each day bleeding into the next, in a monotonous cycle of work, rationing, and the constant low-level fear that defined life under occupation. Marie continued working at the factory under Herr Kessler's rigid supervision, washing uniforms at precisely regulated temperatures, her hands slowly healing from the damage she had inflicted on them during those 6 weeks of sabotage. The new equipment made further resistance impossible, at least through the methods she had used before, and Marie found herself settling into a strange kind of numbness, going through the motions of survival, without the sense of purpose that had sustained her during her secret war. The other workers treated her differently now, with a quiet respect that was never spoken aloud, but was evident in small gestures, the way they shared their meager lunch portions with her, the way they covered for her when she was too exhausted to keep pace with production quotas. They had become conspirators bound by shared knowledge of what she had done, and that bond created a fragile network of solidarity in a place designed to crush such connections. In March, Marie received news that shattered whatever fragile equilibrium she had managed to construct. A resistance courier, moving through the underground networks that still operated despite constant Gestapo crackdowns, delivered a message that her youngest son, Henri, had been killed in a sabotage operation against a rail line south of the city. There were no details about how he died, no body to bury, just a brief confirmation that he had been part of a cell that had successfully destroyed an ammunition transport but had been caught in the subsequent manhunt. Marie received this information in her apartment on a Tuesday evening, standing in the doorway with the courier's words echoing in her mind, and for a long time she simply stood there, unable to move or cry or even fully process what she had been told. Henri had been 24 years old, a student before the war with plans to become a teacher. Now he was gone, erased as completely as if he had never existed, and Marie understood with crushing clarity that this was the price of resistance, the cost that someone always had to pay. She went to work the next day because not going would have drawn attention and questions she couldn't answer. She stood at her station washing uniforms with mechanical precision, while her mind replayed every memory of Henri she could summon, from his childhood to the last time she had seen him 2 years ago, when he had kissed her goodbye and disappeared into the network of safe houses and false identities that sustained the resistance. She wondered if her sabotage had been worth his death, if the few dozen enemy soldiers who had frozen on the Eastern Front balanced out the loss of her son, and the mathematics of that equation made her physically ill. There was no balance in war, she realized, no fair exchange of suffering that made the losses bearable. There was only loss, cascading and compounding until it became impossible to remember what you had been fighting for in the first place. But even in the depths of her grief, Marie couldn't bring herself to regret what she had done at the factory. Henri would have understood, she told herself. He had made his choice to fight and she had made hers, and the fact that both choices led to suffering didn't make them wrong. The factory continued operating through the spring and summer, and Marie continued working, but something fundamental had changed inside her. The fierce determination that had driven her sabotage had been replaced by a kind of grim endurance, a commitment to simply surviving until the war ended one way or another. She no longer looked for opportunities to resist, no longer calculated ways to hurt the enemy or undermine the occupation. She just existed, washing uniforms and collecting her rations and attending Mass on Sundays, where she prayed for Henri and for her other son, whose fate remained unknown. The city around her was slowly deteriorating, the occupation forces growing more brutal as news from the Eastern Front became increasingly desperate, and Marie watched it all with the detachment of someone who had already given everything she had to give. When Herr Kessler announced in August that the factory was increasing production quotas to support a major offensive, Marie simply nodded and adjusted her work pace accordingly. When the Allied bombing raids began targeting the city's industrial zones, she took shelter in the factory basement with the other workers and waited for the explosions to stop. And then, on a morning in late September, everything changed in a way that no one had anticipated. The factory workers arrived to find the gates locked and a notice posted in German and French announcing that the facility was being relocated to Germany as part of a broader evacuation of industrial capacity ahead of the advancing Allied armies. All workers were to report to the train station in 48 hours for transport to new assignments in the Reich, and failure to comply would be considered desertion punishable by execution. Marie read the notice twice, understanding that this was the endgame, the moment when the occupation forces began their retreat and tried to take everything of value with them, including the people who had kept their war machine running. She had 48 hours to decide whether to board that train or disappear into the resistance networks that had consumed her son. It wasn't really a choice at all. Marie went home, packed a small bag with the few possessions that mattered to her, and by nightfall she had vanished into the underground, becoming one more ghost in a city full of people who who had learned to exist in the spaces between official records and military checkpoints. The liberation came in October of 1944, and Marie witnessed it from the window of a safe house in the industrial district, watching as Allied tanks rolled through streets that had been occupied for more than 4 years. The resistance network that had sheltered her emerged from the shadows, armed men and women who had fought an invisible war suddenly becoming visible again, and Marie found herself surrounded by people who knew her story, who had heard through whispered channels about the woman who had sabotaged 500 uniforms and lived to tell about it. They treated her like a hero, a symbol of civilian resistance, but Marie felt no sense of triumph or vindication. She felt tired, hollowed out by loss and survival, and when the celebrations began in the city squares, she stayed in her small room and thought about Henry and her husband and all the people who hadn't lived to see this day. Victory, she realized, didn't erase the cost of winning. It just changed who was left to count the bodies. In the months after liberation, investigators from the new provisional government began documenting acts of resistance and collaboration, building a historical record of who had fought and who had capitulated. Marie was interviewed 3 times, asked to provide details about her sabotage operation at the factory, and each time she told the story in the same flat, emotionless tone, reciting facts without drama or embellishment. The investigators seemed disappointed by her lack of heroic narrative, but they dutifully recorded her testimony and filed it away with thousands of other accounts of small acts of defiance that had collectively weakened the occupation. Marie learned during these interviews that the factory had been bombed by Allied aircraft in November of '44, just weeks after her escape, and that Herr Kessler and most of the remaining workers had been killed in the strike. She also learned that Colette, the young woman who had lied to protect her, had been arrested by the Gestapo in April and had died in custody under circumstances that were officially listed as suicide, but that everyone understood meant torture and execution. The knowledge of Colette's fate broke something inside Marie that had somehow remained intact through everything else. The true impact of Marie's sabotage was never fully quantified, because the chaos of war made precise accounting impossible, but military historians who later examined Wehrmacht supply records and casualty reports from the Eastern Front identified clear patterns that supported the story. In December of 1942, a specific Wehrmacht division receiving supplies from Marie's factory reported unusually high rates of cold weather injuries, with field reports noting that recently issued winter uniforms were poorly fitted and inadequate for the extreme conditions. Medical records showed spikes in frostbite cases, hypothermia incidents, and exposure-related deaths that couldn't be explained by weather conditions alone, and several junior officers filed formal complaints about equipment quality that were dismissed by their superiors as excuses for battlefield failures. The numbers were fragmentary and incomplete, but conservative estimates suggested that Marie's sabotage had directly contributed to the incapacitation of at least 200 soldiers and the deaths of somewhere between 15 and 30 men who might have survived with properly fitted gear. It was a small number in a war that killed millions, but it was also proof that individual resistance mattered, that one woman with access to a washing machine could alter the course of events in ways that rippled far beyond her immediate reach. What makes Marie's story particularly significant is how completely it was forgotten for more than 70 years. Her testimony was filed away in archives that weren't open to researchers until the early 2000s, and even then it took decades for historians to recognize the importance of what she had done. There were no medals, no public recognition, no monuments erected in her honor. Marie lived until 1968, working various jobs in the reconstructed city, never speaking publicly about her wartime actions, never seeking recognition or compensation for the risks she had taken. She was, in every sense, an invisible warrior, someone who fought a crucial battle in the shadows and then returned to ordinary life as if nothing had happened. Her other son, Michel, survived the war and returned home in '45, and Marie never told him the full story of what she had done at the factory, only that she had worked there and survived. It wasn't until after her death, when researchers finally began examining resistance archives systematically, that the truth emerged. The reason this story matters today, the reason it deserves to be remembered and told, is because it reveals a fundamental truth about resistance that our sanitized version of history often obscures. We like to imagine that fighting tyranny requires grand gestures, dramatic confrontations, heroes with weapons and manifestos who make bold stands against overwhelming odds. But the reality is that most resistance happens in small spaces by ordinary people who use whatever tools they have available, whether that's a washing machine, a forged document, a hidden radio, or simply the courage to say no when everyone around them is saying yes. Marie wasn't a soldier or a spy or a saboteur in any traditional sense. She was a 53-year-old laundress with damaged hands and a broken heart who decided that she would rather die fighting than live complicit. And for 6 weeks, in a factory that no one remembered and using methods that no one noticed, she waged her own private war against an enemy that seemed invincible. 500 uniforms, dozens of incapacitated soldiers, a handful of deaths in frozen trenches thousands of miles away. In the grand narrative of the Second World War, it barely registers as a footnote, but to the people who understood what she had done, to the workers who protected her and the resistance fighters who sheltered her and the historians who finally brought her story to light, Marie's sabotage represents something crucial that we forget at our peril. That evil thrives not just through the actions of perpetrators, but through the silence of bystanders, and that the smallest act of defiance, multiplied across millions of ordinary people, is ultimately what makes tyranny unsustainable. Marie's story isn't about heroism in any conventional sense. It's about the dignity of choosing to fight even when the odds are impossible and the cost is unbearable. It's about the power of ordinary people to become extraordinary when circumstances demand it. And it's a reminder that history is full of invisible warriors whose names we'll never know, but whose actions shaped the world we inherited. Marie washed uniforms in a forgotten factory in an occupied city, and somewhere on the frozen steppes of Russia, soldiers died because their jackets didn't fit. That's the truth they didn't want you to know. That's the story that almost disappeared forever, and that's why it matters that we remember her now.